significance of the power of knowing. And so
we'll begin with the history of the black experience here in the United States. So the first blacks that came to the United States were not necessarily blacks that we considered slaves. So 1555, according to some people, was the first date that blacks arrived in America. Of course, we know that there were blacks who traveled probably prior to 1555. But this particular group of blacks were brought to America to be made slaves. And they weren't, say, the typical type of people like typically in American history textbook. You have images of black people or Africans who have no clothing. They're kind of people that you would consider maybe coming out of a jungle. When in reality, the people who were coming here were scientists, they were mathematicians, they were theologians, they had religion, they had language, they had culture, they had science, they had mathematics. If we were to go in most schools today and we ask children or students and teachers, if somebody asked you your perception of Africa, what would you say? And when I ask that question, most people say, well, I think of starvation, I think of diseases, I think of people who are poor. They never mention the great educational centers of Africa. And so in 1555, when these blacks arrived, they were put through a process, a 64-year process that historically they don't speak about in a textbook, because the 64 years was so brutal, so diabolical, that they couldn't mention it. And during those 64 years, these blacks from Africa were stripped of their language, their names, their culture, their religion. And at the point that they were stripped of these things, this is how you get the terminology, a Negro. So Negro means a person now who is dead. When you genuflect the G out and you put the word C in, you get the word necro. Naim Akbar talks about this in his book. So as a dead people, dead to the knowledge of their culture, dead to the knowledge of their religion, in 1865, when, and we would call this the original brainwashing. So now blacks in America don't know their language. And this is what Malcolm was talking about when Malcolm said, what is your name? It couldn't have been Sam Jones. It couldn't have been David, because they didn't have those names in Africa. So now you're in a country speaking a foreign language, English, and you are not from England. So all of these things, when you put this in a context in education in the 21st century, and they talk about test scores and often try to put black students in the category of failing schools, you have to examine historically that the English language that you test us on is not our original language. And so I would call it a dead level. So in 1865, Civil War comes. And after the Civil War, William Watkins, in his book titled The White Architects of Black Education, he talks about how education was framed. So prior to 1865, you've got to remember that it was a crime for black people to be caught reading. So just imagine now, you're coming from countries where you're scholars, you're readers. Now you're in a foreign country and you can't speak your language, but more so, you don't have access to literature to read. And if you're caught reading, it's a crime that's punishable by death. So in 1865, the Civil War comes, and here you have the construction now of an education system that was being developed by wealthy philanthropists who are saying, okay, we've got to develop an education system or an education plan for these newly freed people. So what kind of education system are you going to develop? So in that time frame, as they were meeting, it was called the Negro question. How are we going to teach these newly freed people? And William Watkins writes that in the plan, it was a 75-year plan to make blacks submissive and docile. So if you're in, say, San Francisco, you have this event tonight. I can talk about black liberation theology, black liberation pedagogy, the power of knowing, Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey. It doesn't disturb you. But if I were in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, where the majority of black people live, this would be an event that you couldn't hold. And so again, when Watkins makes this point in his book that it was a 75-year plan. Now I want you to think of a 75-year plan from 1865, 75 years brings you to 1940. 75 years from 1940 brings you to 2015. We're only now in 2022, which is about 80-some years from the time of that plan to educate black people. So what is the impact of a 75-year plan on the education of black people in the 21st century? And so as we look at William Watkins' work, it brings to mind the work of critical pedagogues, people like Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And he talked about the role of schools playing a role in domesticating or liberating people. So Paulo Freire says that typically when you go to school for oppressed people, people deposit information. In other words, people talk at you and not with you. The teacher knows all and the student is ignorant. And so in schools today, if you travel in the South, and even if you travel in some places here in San Francisco where black and poor people would attend, the school systems and the schools are very oppressive. And so Paulo Freire tackles this oppression and he says, okay, schools can domesticate you. Meaning that as opposed to helping you to be free, they're actually designed to school you in the interest of the people who have the power. And so when Paulo Freire was making his talk and writing his books, prior to Paulo Freire, you had black scholars like Carter G. Woodson and W.E.B. Du Bois. So Carter G. Woodson wrote a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And in that book, Carter G. Woodson was a precursor to Paulo Freire. But if you went to, say, American Education Research Association, and they were talking about these great educators, and they mentioned Paulo Freire, they won't mention Carter G. Woodson. If you're in a teacher education program, you read Paulo Freire, you read Michael Apple, you read Henry Giroux, you read Bill Pynard, but you won't read W.E.B. Du Bois. You won't read Carter G. Woodson. You won't read Marcus Garvey. You won't read Elijah Muhammad. You won't read Malcolm X. And as a result of not reading that, all of the rhetoric around social justice is just a pastime. It's a fancy. It's a fad. Because if it wasn't a fad, you would see in licensure exams that prepare teachers, they would be tested on how much knowledge they have of what I call critical black pedagogues. And the reason I use critical black pedagogues is because when I was looking at how we train teachers, and I started observing that even though we were talking social justice, we were talking being anti-racist, there weren't any black people that were being used. So I said, okay, what I see is a critical black pedagogy because it was black thought leaders who framed the discourse around social justice, but today they're invisible. And so I wrote a book titled Critical Black Pedagogy, The Brothers Speak. And what I did was I took and edited speeches and writings from various authors, James Baldwin, Martin Luther King, Booker T. Washington, who's the other person I used? Frederick Douglass. So I pulled all those people together, Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad, all in one volume that scholars of education could read. And so as we look at this emergence of critical pedagogy, critical black pedagogy in particular, we have to put this in a context. So let's say if you traveled across America, we know that the teaching force is majority white females. How do white females interact with black students when their perception of those students is based on images that they've seen on television? So if you turn on the television, you see black basketball players. You see Charles Barkley. You see a couple of black people on CNN because they sponsored to be there. They go along with the dominant narrative. But black thought leaders who might have a different position that would position black people for true freedom, you don't see them on the TV screen. So when you think about CNN, these are mainstream people. You wouldn't find people on the Panthers, Black Panthers on CNN doing a commentary. They wouldn't even give them a show. But they'll give you a show if, again, you fit that narrative. So white teachers now, perception of black students in predominantly black schools and black spaces is based on images that they see on television. So if I walked in a school, and even if I talked to young people and I asked them, can you talk to me about the baby? The baby is a rapper. They know the baby. They know Lil Wayne. They know Lil Bootsy. They know Savage. They know Megan Thee Stallion. So the images that they see all come from images that are projected by a corporate world that produces a certain kind of image of black youth. And so now when they get to school, the school system is set in a way that the curriculum does not even engage the needs of the students. So one of the things that critical pedagogues would ask is, who decides what you read in school? Who decides what is tested? Who decides how the test is given? So Carter G. Woodson spoke about this in the 1930s. He said the same people that are oppressing you are developing the school system for you. Now here Elijah Muhammad took it a step further. He said if a man won't treat you right, what would make you think he's going to teach you right? So when you get in the school, your education should not be preparing you simply for a job. Your education should be preparing you to produce jobs, that you can develop jobs, develop community, develop a country of your own. And so these are radical positions when you look at this context of education for freedom versus our education for domestication. So if, say for example, let's use another example. Let's say, I don't know how many of you have ever been in the Amazon warehouses where people work at, and the FedEx workhouses where people work at. But one day, go out and if you ever get a chance, go and just observe what happens in those warehouses where people work. And what you'll find is what Joel Spring talks about in terms of how schools operate from a human capitalist ideology. Meaning that the primary basis of school in America is based on producing workers. Workers for who? Workers for FedEx. Workers for Amazon. Workers for Tesla. Not to be free people. So when you go to school, you are schooled to believe that the things that you do in the society is the proper thing to do. Let me give you, and I'm going to go back to this schooling piece at FedEx. So I went to FedEx, and I had a chance to observe. And everything that you see in FedEx, you find it in a public school. You get in, they tell you, walk in a straight line, because they got cars moving around. They got psychology on the board, and see, you could move up. One day, you'll be able to drive the little cart. Instead of unpacking it with your hands, you'll be able to drive the cart. That's a big promotion, I guess. So, and then you in FedEx, there's a person who sits behind a desk who's like an overseer, watching you unpack the truck. And as you unpack the truck, He's observing. Okay, you finished with that truck. Let me move you to the other truck. So schooling prepares you to not ask questions. If I'm unloading the truck and you sitting there watching me, how much they paying you to watch me? And if you are watching me and they paying you more money, how much they paying the person who was in the human resources office? And if the human resources office person is making more money, how about the owner of the company? How does the owner make over so many thousands of dollars per hour and the average person $15, $20 an hour, and you're not angry? But you're not angry because your education made it that you would accept that. So Carter G. Woodson again says that you don't have to train a person to go to the back door. Their education will make them go to the back door, and if there isn't a back door, they'll build one. And so when you think about education in that context, what you begin to see education as a human capitalist ideology to prepare people for work. Let's take another example. Just think about this. So most people go to a job. They make money to do what? Buy stuff. What you gonna buy? I'm gonna buy me a car. I'm gonna buy me a house. I'm gonna go and buy me some food. And if you look at popular culture, it's all about the Benjamins. And so now, with the popular culture all about the Benjamins, you don't stop and ask a question. You don't ask the question, say, I never thought about it. The earth produces that cucumber for free. It produces all the food you eat for free. But somebody has stolen the land and taken the land and says, okay, now, if you want a cucumber, you give me a paper, $1 that you took from a tree that you made paper on. Now, it's just ordinary paper. Nothing significant about the paper other than somebody says, okay, we put some symbols on it, we put some other codes on it that we can scan it, and now you give me the paper for the cucumber, and the more papers that I own, the more power that I have. That's not a normal type of civilization. That's not original civilization. And so as you begin to think about your education coincides with making you believe that that is the proper education. Now you say we work 40 hours a week. Who told you you had to work 40 hours a week? See, somebody is telling you that 40 hours a week. They were going to give black people 40 acres and a mule. Why did they want to give them 40 acres and a mule when, 40 is a significant number? So it's not that you should be working 40 hours a week. This is, again, part of the conditioning process of what the education system does. So I'm going to go back to this piece on curriculum. If I traveled across the United States, I'm in San Francisco, and I saw a brother here in San Francisco. How does the brother in San Francisco have the same disposition as the brother in Ville Platte? They're in Ville Platte, Louisiana, two totally different spaces. How does that happen? Because you're dealing with social engineering, and you're dealing with the science and the art of war. See, most people think of warfare as a physical gun, but warfare is also silent weapons. If I'm in your community and I control the radio station in your community, and your community is constantly being bombarded with certain types of music that you can't deconstruct in school. So all of a sudden now, I saw Lil Wayne, and I took in Lil Wayne. Now I want to be Lil Wayne. So now when I get to school, I'm grilled out. And then when I get to Louisiana from San Francisco, the guy down there in Louisiana, he want to be Lil Wayne too. So now an educator must come And this is where James Cone talks about black liberation theology. You can't really understand, and I learned this more as a professor here at San Francisco State. When I read James Cone's work, I had read part of it, but when I came here, I took a deep dive into it. So James Cone says that, and James Cone got this now from Malcolm. Malcolm got it from Elijah Muhammad. But James Cone said it like this. He said, wherever there are oppressed people, you should expect the visitation of God. He's saying when God comes, God is on the side of the oppressed. He said, in fact, Jesus is the oppressed one. Now, when you put James Cone in that context, black liberation theology, and you go back to the 60s, and you look at people like Malcolm, here Malcolm was talking black revolution, black self-determination that he had gotten again from his teacher. And so Malcolm was a threat. Black leaders were a threat. So what did the government do in America? They set up what was called a counterintelligence program. Now think about that. You're gonna, when you say counterintelligence, that means intelligence is coming to a people. So now you're gonna counter that intelligence. You're gonna take that intelligence that's coming to them away. And so with the counterintelligence program, what the people who were constructing education realize is there's certain things that they can't read. They can't read certain things in schools. We can only allow students to read things that are safe. So in black liberation theology, think about this. If God is coming to oppress people, what is God bringing to them? He's not bringing them money. He's bringing them wisdom and knowledge. And if he's bringing knowledge, then it would mean that the people in power would say, okay, we've got to make sure that this kind of knowledge doesn't get into schools. We've got to make sure that our teachers are trained and prepared a certain way. We've got to make sure that they're being tested. So if I give you a test and I grade you on the test, then what happens is the grading of the test sets up the curriculum and sets the parameters for what you should know. And by doing that, I can keep you under my control. And so black liberation theology is a very key component to the liberation of black people, but it also opens the pathway for the liberation of the whole of humanity. But why would you say that? How could you say the liberation of black people is tied to the whole of humanity? And that is because when you look at the blueprint of what black thought leaders brought, they open a pathway for people to really examine the injustices that exist within the society. And so I want to close with this final kind of thought here, and then I'll open up to any questions that you might have. When the architects of black education were framing black education, there was a senator by the name of, I think it was Senator Berry. And he said, we've cut off every possible venue by which light might enter the slave's mind. Now, light represents knowledge. So if we cut off the light, we could extinguish their capacity, and then they would be on the level of a beast. So if light represents knowledge, then we have to think about education in a totally different way. And one of the ways that we should think about education is this relationship, heaven-earth relationship. What do you mean heaven and earth? So as you have a heaven, you have rain. And rain pours on an earth. And what the rain does is it causes an earth that is dead to begin now to germinate the life that is within the earth. So the great teacher Elijah Muhammad taught black people like this. He said, the wisdom of God lives in human beings. So if the wisdom of God is in the people, it means that you need a certain kind of teacher to bring that wisdom out. And so the heaven-earth relationship means that the teacher has to have a certain kind of wisdom. And when that wisdom is rained down on students, it begins to germinate the life within the students. Now their creative mind is touched. And once the creative mind is tapped, then you don't go to a job. You don't go to work. You don't go and say, oh, man, I got to go to work. Oh, so-and-so, I'm going to work, and I hate going to work. You go to purpose. And so Elijah Muhammad gave this point to his students. He said, if you're looking for God, God is like this. He said, imagine a house in your mind. So can you imagine that? He said, okay, now, if you can take the thought that you have in your mind and make that thought a reality, take the house out of your mind and make it real. You see, that's the God right there. So that kind of education in a public school where black kids are, you won't get it. And this is why I'm saying today that the power is in knowing. And the power is in black liberation pedagogy, because when you have some of those keys, you can liberate people to discover their divine essence. And so I'm going to stop here and take questions, and then we can kind of talk about whatever you want to talk about on this subject. I think I have, is it 25 minutes left? So any questions that you might want to ask? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, one, mind blown. This is fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on HBCU? Because a lot of them, as you mentioned, were started by seemingly self-described benevolent folks. Many of them are connected to churches that have their own histories of oppression, and that's the interest in maintaining status quo. But are they possible sources for the very sort of education empowerment that you're talking about, or are they just basically puppets being applied?
They're probably a combination of both. Historically black colleges and universities. So these are like Xavier University in New Orleans. This is Southern University, Jackson State, North Carolina A&T. I could go on and on because I've worked at probably at least 4 or 5 of them. So, but I think it's a combination of both. So what you find at HBCUs, again, is this hiding of knowledge. And if you were to look at the curriculum, for example, when I chaired 3 departments, one at Fayetteville State, one at North Carolina A&T, one at Prairie View A&M University. And at each of the universities where I chaired, we had difficulty including courses that would create a critical consciousness in students to do something in their communities, in their schools and communities that would turn those schools and communities around. So if you're in the university, just think about it. If you're at UC Berkeley and you're looking at the study of genetics, and you're trying to come up with how genetics can play a role in curing cancers and diseases, all right? But at HBCUs, you're not really, not all of them, but in some cases, you're not really focused on the creation of new knowledge. You're focused on accepting what other people produce. And so that means you can't read the same things that you would get at UC. How does UC Berkeley have a Ph.D. program in black studies? But Southern University, where the civil rights movement began basically in Palmetto. Palmetto, Louisiana is one of the hot spots where Vice President Harris, one of the persons who reared her, is from that area. But it started in a little small town. But you don't even know that, and you could live right in the village where the movement began, but you can't take a black studies curriculum at Southern University in Baton Rouge. They wouldn't offer a Black Studies program. And so this is how you have this distinction of keeping a people enslaved. And so anybody who comes that is speaking truth to power may sound offensive because the people used to hearing things that puff up the dominant group. But if I come and give you a critique like Malcolm, people say, well, we have Malcolm now on the mall here at SF State. And, you know, there are universities that they name after Malcolm, like in Chicago. But that's only because they have shifted Malcolm to make Malcolm safe. And you read this in scholars like Sonia Nieto, who says that when you look at people from oppressed groups, the only time that we really include them is when now they have been re-engineered to fit the dominant narrative. So Malcolm fits a dominant narrative today. And he's a money-making thing. Because if you look at his autobiography, I mean, it made millions of dollars. So if you do something on Malcolm, it's safe. But there are other black leaders, you can't even mention their name. It's not politically safe. So in HBCUs, there's a power that could potentially be there. But when you get on the ground, you see even the selection of their presidents is selections from boards. These boards are the same boards, governing boards, that make laws and policies that discriminate against black people. But they could be at LSU and play football. They can be at Alabama and play football. And they can be at all these universities that you get ready to see on Saturday night, and it's hundreds of thousands of people at the game and a few black athletes out on the field. And the crowds are all white there. And on a Saturday, LSU is playing Alabama, and they're going to make millions of dollars. And the money is going to the business owners who are making the policies to incarcerate black men in Angola. And so these are the kinds of things that we don't talk about. Now, if I gave you the scenario of football games, and I said to you, did you notice the games that people play tell you something about the psychology? So why are people playing with balls? Because it's something about sex and gender in games coming out of the Civil War. So whoever can control, this is Bill Pinar. This is not Abul Pitre. This is Bill Pinar, who was one of my colleagues at LSU. He's a very well-known white professor, gay white man. He and I were really good friends, still are. But Bill Pinar said it like this. He told me, you see, Abu is about control of the penis. He said, this is why we call them penal institutions. Because if we can put black folks in the penal institution, we can control their ability to reproduce. So here you got a football game where you're trying to block the brown ball from going between the white pole. Now it's a yellow pole. And so that meant keeping you from the white woman. Now in a football game, when they get to the end, these are things that they don't teach in school. When they get to the end, they play a bowl game. They're going to play the Sugar Bowl where? In New Orleans. Why? Because black people were picking sugar cane there. They're going to play the Cotton Bowl in Texas. Why? Because black people were picking cotton in Texas. They're going to play the Peach Bowl in Georgia. That bowl is where black folks picking peaches at. So every bowl game, when they were taking all these monuments down, they should have renamed all the bowl games. Because the bowl games represent the agricultural economy of the South and black bodies making money. So, again, to your question of HBCUs, they don't have that free space like people would think. So, if you went to an education program and you were getting your doctoral degree, you at University of Wisconsin, you would take critical race theory. You would take educating African American students. You would take a course on social justice. You would take a course on critical pedagogy. But at a HBCU, you're going to take a course on organizational theory. You're going to take one on seminar and leadership. You're going to take one on strategic planning. Well, what are you planning? You're only planning to maintain the status quo. Because when I send you out as a superintendent, you don't have the ability to critique because you haven't read the right kind of knowledge. And this is why when you see that movie, is the I, Robot, or where the robots are there, and the robot now is able to dream, and they ask the guy, say, you haven't asked the right question. So in these institutions, the right body of knowledge is not there. Because if it was, just think. Let me give you an example. I'll give you another example. Can you imagine? Cities now have black mayors, black superintendent, black police chief. So if you got three, did I say superintendent? So you've got all these three major positions. How is it that the condition of black people doesn't change? Because the mind of the people who are in those positions fulfill, again, what Carter G. Woodson said, miseducation. So if you miseducated, the lens from which you see is this, you look at skin color. But it's not necessarily the skin color, it's the positionality of how you see the world. So now, if you see the world from a European perspective, then you're going to maintain those same systems that are in place, and the politicians and the corporate owners who set these things in place can sit behind and say, okay, look at, they could have a HBCU. Here's a black president over there. The grass can't even get cut because they got to go to the board for money. And the president won't get mad. Say, okay, I'm going to get 5 or 10 community leaders, and we're going to go down, and we're going to have a talk with the governor. So those are the things that you have to kind of put in that context. So I'm sorry if I went over, but you brought all these things out. Yes, ma'am. Mhm. Yeah, well, you see, it's always that case where they give us choices to choose. It's Malcolm versus Martin. It could never be Malcolm and Martin, Booker T and W.E.B. It could never be the two together. But when I was reading some of Booker T's ideas, Booker T had an idea that was so profound. I hadn't read it before. And I remember in high school when I was teaching it, the students were debating. One of my students jumped out of his chair. He said, Booker T wasn't nothing but a Tom. And he was a really good student and he ended up not doing too much. But Booker T used this, he said this, and I'm paraphrasing him. He said, I'm hoping for the day that a white person has to come to a black person to get along. And they can determine what kind of job they get. So when I read that, I said, Booker T. Washington wasn't as weak as they try to portray him. He probably was very skillful in using and manipulating the system to get what he could get to help black people produce for their own. So he kind of, in a sense now, to a certain degree, he didn't use the term separation. But if you study his program, he had black people who were working on how to build homes, how to do all those things independently. And so he put them kind of in a separate space to do that. And of course, he was using money from white people in power. And so, you know, naturally they kind of propped him up to make him a big guy. But he was in fact, I think in that book, I have him as a critical black pedagogue. Critical Black Pedagogy has 4 planks to it. It has Afrocentricity, which means looking at the world from an African-centered perspective. What I'm giving you today is from an African-centered perspective. It's from the perspective of a person who grew up black in the South, saw my grandmother working for Miss Prissy. You say, how could you see? Because I went to Miss Prissy's home. I remember the argument between my aunt and my grandmother, asking her, why are you going to Miss Prissy? Those days are over. I was trying to figure out what days are you talking about. So going back to that point, the point that I'm making is that when we look at Booker T. Washington and many other blacks, they were working on behalf of black people, and sometimes they get caught in terms of how they are re-engineered in the society. And I'll go back to this point when I mentioned Afrocentricity. So I gave you one plank on critical black pedagogy: Afrocentricity, critical pedagogy, multicultural education, and African American spirituality. See, with black people, we always put God at the center. Spirituality is a major component. So you can't tell us that you separating church and state and tell us that you educating us, because we know it's something else to it. And so again, these are some of the challenges. And even here in California. So, you know, if I were to look at schools in California and my kids go to school, my son was telling me, he said, Dad, I could let him come, he could tell you better than I could. He would tell you, he told me, he said, Dad, he said, the black and the Asian kids, they don't treat us the same in the school. So I said, well, he said, you know, white kids can say things, they get away with it. If we say it, the teacher is all over us. So what I did was I said, well, let me do my own study. I went in and started looking at the absentee rate. I wanted to pull the data. So I saw that black students were absent more frequently than all the other students. So I had him look at it. He said, where did you get that data from? I said, well, I pulled it off the website. So I said, let me ask you a question. I said, why do you think the black students are absent more frequently and they stay out of school longer than the white students? He said, well, I can answer that question. He says, because they don't treat us right. So what we do is we tell our parents that my stomach is hurting. So I said, oh, so that's why you've been telling me your stomach is hurt. So again, these are some of the challenges that we've got to overcome. And you all see the discourse around critical race theory. They never taught critical race theory in a public school. What they were teaching is multicultural education. But politicians we use critical race theory to train teachers to have a critical perspective on how to look for elements of racism in the school. That means that when you're there, you have a consciousness. So again, these are all smoke screens that are part of the education process to keep us in a state of confusion, if you will. So I hope I answered your question on Booker T. I think Booker T was somewhere in between, but he had some elements of a critical black consciousness. Any other questions that you want to ask? Just feel free to ask anything. Somebody asked me, said I needed to mention something about my journey here. I can't remember. Was it you, Precious, that mentioned to me I needed to say something? I did. I did. I went to Edinburgh University. I was out in Pennsylvania. I was the Carter G. Woodson professor there. But I never expected to travel to all these different places. And in each place that I've traveled, I've studied their systems of education, particularly how they work well and how they might not work well in the interests of, in particular, people who come from oppressed groups. And so it's been a good learning curve. San Francisco State is probably the most unique of any university that I've worked at. And San Francisco State has the potential, I think, to be a light to, actually, and it has been a light to a large degree, because, I mean, when you think of black studies, first black studies department forming here in San Francisco, and the kind of conversations that you can engage in and have a certain kind of freedom. See, when I moved even from North Carolina, I would always tell people, well, I'm halfway free because I can go into class. I teach doctoral students. Then when I got to San Francisco, I said, wow, I didn't know how much I was domesticated. I get in the meetings, and the professors here, I mean, they bring in fire. So I'm like, wow. And it's across in the College of Ethnic Studies. It's a college, and it's a group of people that are truly committed to eradicating the isms that cause human suffering. And so there's a potential there. And this is why when I use black liberation theology, I want to give you just a tidbit of what I see in it that is kind of missing. You see, Elijah Muhammad brought a whole lot to America and the world that you don't know about. So, for example, you think that Mr. Muhammad was talking just bad about white people. That's your perception of him because he used the language at that time. Just think of the language that he used. When he said, go back in the early education of black people, that was all Bible based. So if you go right now in the South and you go in the churches in the South, they got a white man up on the wall as Jesus. They looking at Paul and David and Saul. And those names don't exist in Africa, but the context of the Bible and the people, that's Africa. They say Middle East, but that's a 50-mile landmass, is all Africa. So when he used the term that the white man is the devil, he was striking a blow to white supremacy that people couldn't understand. Why? Because what he was saying was, okay, how could you be like God and you just lynched that man on the tree? And he saw black people being lynched at 10 years old. So that kind of experience stayed with him. But he was more so talking science and mathematics. He was talking about define age. He was talking about what Michio Kaku was talking about in physics, where he talks about looking for the God particle. And what Albert Einstein was looking at when he said he wanted to know the mind of God in creating the universe. And so these are the kinds of bodies of knowledge that are hidden from the masses of people. Because if you began to read it, you would say, wow, you mean to tell me that a man who went to the 4th grade of school was talking about life on Mars in the 1930s and told you where the life on Mars was in the 1930s. Now you just made a contraption that went there in 2022, and what you looking for? Life on Mars. So, again, this is part of the reason why I say a black liberation pedagogy, because if you take prophecy, prophecy talks about a people who are no people. The tail now being the head. That means that this new wisdom and knowledge is not coming from the traditional perspective. Who would ever perceive a little Negro from Georgia having a new body of knowledge that unites the whole human family into a whole other concept of living and learning? And so you're seeing glimpses of that now when they talk about critical race theory. Where did that originate? Derek Bell. Derek Bell, where did you get critical race theory? He was influenced by black nationalism. Who was your influence, Derek Bell? My influence was Malcolm. Who taught Malcolm? Critical white studies. You ever heard of critical whiteness studies? A critique of whiteness? And trying to understand how to dismantle what it means to be white. This is white privilege. This is Zeus Leonardo's work. This is Race Trader. These are all these writers now who are deconstructing what it means to be white and to be what they call more human. Where did you get your first deconstruction of whiteness? Some say it was W.E.B. Du Bois. But W.E.B. Du Bois didn't offer you the kind of critique that Muhammad offered you. And so again, these are the kinds of black thought leaders that you don't read about, and their prophecies of what would happen in the world, in America, you see it happening today. You call it climate change. They use other terms. You say, well, it's climate change. Look at how the weather is changing. And pick up his book, The Fall of America in the 1970s, and he tells you, look at all these storms that would hit America because you have a whole population of people that have been enslaved and have not been given justice. But James Cone, again, God has come. And so this is where we are with this power of knowing. So, any final questions, thoughts? I'm open to anything you want to ask. I'm going to check my time. I'm 2 minutes. Yes. Yeah, so it's kind of like this subaltern type of education where we don't have the traditional ways of going to in terms of education. And I'm glad you asked that question because it goes back to what I said, but I'm going to make this final point. The point that I'm going to make is that I don't think schools are going to become like Blockbuster is. You see, and I studied these things here in San Francisco recently. So Blockbuster went out of business because the guy had some overdue tapes. And he said, I got to pay $35 every time for these late tapes. He said, you know what? I'm going to come up with a different way. And this is how he came up with Netflix. So now you're on the verge of the metaverse. And so with the metaverse now, you can be in a classroom and you literally in that world. I was on the virtual reality like a couple days ago because I'm trying to get Africana studies to be the first on the metaverse. Imagine what it's like to be at the Million Man March and you sitting like you really there. Or you in there and Dr. King is giving a speech in 1963 and you on the mall like you can literally touch the people and then Dr. King you can ask him questions and he respond. So I think where we're going is we're actually entering into a whole new world. And the traditional ways of educating, they won't be exactly what we see, be totally different. And they're doing these things right now in San Francisco. There's a place called Masterclass. I don't know if you're familiar with Masterclass. I went down to go and actually see. I said, well, let me go and see what is going on at the Masterclass because it's different. It's almost like you have a class, but you infuse like concepts with movies and videos that the class becomes like a movie. And I would tell my students all the time, when you look at a curriculum, think of a movie. And if you set it up like a movie, you guiding people through certain points of learning that you keep them connected. So now this master class that's here in San Francisco, they have Seth Curry, they have Cornell West teaching the class. They got a couple other big name people, tennis players, all kinds of people. So I said, well, I need to go to the master class so I can find out what's going on. But when I got there, they had a police guard, so you can't come in. Even if you have an appointment, you can't get in. So again, it's because education is moving in a different direction from what we traditionally know. So I think that's where we headed. We headed into a whole new world, and the metaverse is going to open up something we weren't expecting.